Spotlighting Hawaii's leaders.
We want to bring in Governor David E.
Good morning, Mr. Mayor.
Lieutenant Governor, good morning. Thanks so much for joining us. Mayor Derek Kawakami.
Thank you so much, Senator, for being here.
Spotlighting the issues.
Where is the virus right now in our community?
How much is this overall going to cost the state?
How are you responding to the community's concerns? Talk about the level of citations that you guys are writing.
Spotlight Hawaii with Yanji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suji on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Long's Drugs.
Aloha and good morning. Thanks for starting your week off with us. I'm Ryan Kalei Suji, joined by Yanji Denise, and this is Spotlight Hawaii on the digital platforms of the Honolulu Star-Advertiser. This morning, we're going to be spotlighting a topic that we seem to be talking more and more about over the past few years, Angie.
Yeah, that's right. We're focusing right now on coastal erosion and the effects of climate change here in the islands. Dr. Chip Fletcher, Interim Dean of the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at Manoa, is joining us live this morning. He's an expert in the field, and we're so lucky to have him this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Yanji. Good morning, Ryan.
So let's dive into it. I think that a lot of people were shocked about 2 months ago in February when we saw that house fall basically into the beach on the North Shore. We've got a picture of that to remind everybody of what that looked like. You'll remember, of course, that I'll put it up right there. Dr. Fletcher, let's dive in. What are we seeing here, and what can we expect in the years to come?
So what we're looking at is the slow landward migration of the shoreline in response to sea level rise. The ocean is rising because much of the world's ice is melting. That adds mass to the ocean. And the ocean is absorbing 90% of the heat that is being trapped in the atmosphere as a result of our fossil fuel emissions. That's heat that would otherwise escape to space. And as a result, the ocean is thermally expanding. So sea level rise requires that the edge of the ocean expand, migrate landward, and it's going to occur at the expense of the land that's located there. So if you have a house, if you have a road, if we have any of our assets, which many of our shorelines around the world are places where we have placed our treasure. We have invested in coastal land. We have bought coastal land and built on it. That land is at risk. It is threatened by this shoreline migration.
You know, we saw last week as well, homeowners taking matters into their own hands, trying to protect their property also on the North Shore. What should residents in those communities expect? And how do they deal with a situation like this when they're seeing their backyard essentially going into the ocean?
Yeah, this problem is not going to stop for centuries. In fact, the science actually indicates that even if we were to stop our greenhouse gas emissions today, we're looking at over 1,000 years of continued sea level rise. And this is because the ocean is so huge and deep that warm waters at the surface are being cycled down to the bottom of the ocean. And that process takes 800 to 1,200 years. And the entire time, that water is thermally expanding. So sea level rise is a new permanent condition on our coastline for which we are not prepared. Our coastal zone management system around the nation, here in Hawaii, and in fact globally, was not built or designed to handle a migrating shoreline. It was built or designed to handle shoreline variability, erosion that would then recover the following season, or maybe a hurricane would hit. And so we have building codes for houses involving tying them together, attaching the roof, and putting the houses on stilts. But when you're talking about sea level rise, you're talking about the perpetual landward migration of the shoreline, and there's really nothing you can do about it except get out of the way. That is the problem. How do we move away from the shoreline in a way that is organized, that doesn't penalize either the public taxpayer or the shoreline private landowner in a way that is inappropriate or unfair. This is referred to as managed retreat or strategic retreat. And nobody around the nation has actually yet figured out how to do this. And certainly here in Hawaii, there's been a lot of talk about how to move away from our eroding shorelines. But we don't yet have a plan with details.
And how much of a retreat would we actually need, and how fast do we need to do it?
Well, the current understanding of sea level rise is that we're looking at about 1 foot of sea level rise by mid-century, so over the next 30 years. Now, we're still in the phase of sea level rise, which is relatively slow, but it is going to quickly accelerate in the second half of the century. So whereas, about 1 foot to 2050 from today, then we're looking at potentially another 3 feet from 2050 to the end of the century. And add to that the fact that we have extraordinarily high tides that occur at regular times in the year. We refer to these as king tides. Add to that we can get onshore winds. We can get large waves that in the summertime break on the south shores and in the winter on the north shores. And those waves will push water onto the shoreline. And then if it happens to rain on top of that at high tide, we get extraordinary flooding. We saw in Waikiki on December 5th, when a Kona low weather system hit Hawaii during the course of a king tide, we saw flooding up higher than the undercarriages of vans on Kalakaua Avenue. So this level of flooding is getting worse. Coastal erosion is one of the aspects of sea level rise. Waikiki and the primary urban core doesn't really see as much coastal erosion as they do see groundwater flooding and storm drain backflow and then wave overwash on the shoreline. But all of this needs to be figured out, and we're still not there yet. We still are not at a point where we know how to handle this situation in a way that is fair and equitable.
We saw a lot of preventative measures being taken and continue to be debated over, whether it be sand dunes, we see sea bag walls, we see proposals for sea walls in general. What do you think is the best form of preventative measures? I mean, I know it's not a long-term fix because there will ultimately be issues for the long haul. But for some of these residents or business owners or associations that have property on the water, what are some of those? What do you think is the best measure moving forward to help with some of these preventative measures?
I think that every community has its own solution. In fact, individual homeowners will have their own solution. But let's start broad. Seawalls. Everybody wants to put in a seawall when their home is being undermined by coastal erosion. The problem with that is if you are on a beach, the seawall will end up destroying the beach. It will first narrow the beach, and then the beach will entirely disappear. It does this for several reasons. The waves will, at high tide or if there's high surf, will bounce off the front of the seawall and tend to scour sand. You've got twice the wave energy when you have waves reflecting off of that wall rather than dissipating their energy as they run up a sandy shoreline. And fundamentally, you are constraining that natural beach environment from migrating landward, which is what it wants to do in order to continue to exist as the ocean rises. Beaches are not only a natural ecosystem, they are public trust lands. And we are guaranteed as citizens of Hawaii access to and along the shoreline. And when a beach disappears because a private landowner or a section of highway or some other asset is being protected by a seawall, that is loss of the public trust. And state agencies, and particularly Department of Land and Natural Resources when it comes to beaches, are entrusted with that fiducial responsibility to maintain these lands, public trust lands, for the good of the public. So when it comes to beaches, building a seawall, especially in the case of rising sea level, will destroy the beach. There are other places where seawalls are perfectly appropriate. Our ports, around massive public assets, perhaps like airports. There are places where seawalls certainly are important to have, and it's worth investing in maintaining them. But when it comes to beaches, seawalls are not the right approach. Building sand dunes is a temporary measure. In Waikiki, we spend a few $1,000,000 a couple of times a decade to take sand that's located offshore in sand fields in slightly deeper water and hydraulically pump it onto the shoreline to augment the beach with sand. I view that as maintenance, the same way when you build a highway, you want to maintain it. Most of the beach in Waikiki is an engineered ecosystem, if you will. And we've been placing sand there for over a century, continuing to do so at accelerating rates because sea level is causing faster and faster rates of erosion and threatening that beach more and more every year, sea level rise. It eventually will get too expensive for us to continue to put sand on Waikiki Beach, but it's a maintenance project in my mind, whereas you go outside of Waikiki to the more natural shorelines running up and down the windward side, north shore of this island, and the leeward side. I don't view that as a pure cost and benefit effort, pure maintenance effort. I view that as a natural ecosystem and a state public trust issue.
There's a question here from Ingrid. She brings up Ala Moana. Is the Ala Moana area going to be flooded in the next 30 years with predicted 1-foot sea level rise? We bring up this area also because not only is there a concentration of homes and businesses in that area, or condos and businesses rather, it's also the projected path of the rail project. What are your thoughts on the way the rail project currently the route is, and whether or not that is wise given the impact that we are predicting to Ala Moana and beyond?
So I sit on the City and County of Honolulu Climate Change Commission, and we work with the Resilience Office for the city. And pre-COVID, I think it was 2018, 2019, we put together a guidance paper providing commission guidance on the issue of sea level rise. And we recommended that every city agency take into account about 1 meter of sea level rise or 3.2 feet of sea level rise in their planning, in their budgeting, and in their year-to-year activities. And for particularly large public infrastructure projects like rail, that's 6 feet of sea level rise be taken into account. And in response, the rail from Chinatown to Ala Moana Center was slightly redesigned so that should the roads passing underneath the elevated rail be raised 6 feet, there would still be federal clearance, I think it's 16 feet or 18 feet, before a truck would run into any problem passing underneath rail. So our elevated rail from Chinatown to Ala Moana Center has actually been redesigned and adapted to 6 feet of sea level rise. So I actually see it as a prime example of adapting to sea level rise. And what are we going to do in Kaka'ako and Waikiki? How will we handle sea level rise? Are we going to pick up and move, or are we going to, in the normal course of redesigning and building buildings, are we going to redesign in a way that allows us to live with water? Roads, open space, buried infrastructure, and building stock can all be reimagined and redesigned in place under various increments of sea level rise. Eventually, if we get to many, many feet of sea level rise in a future century, I think it's going to be a very different game. But we're still talking about on the order of 4 feet of sea level rise this century. And all of the assets that we've looked at in Waikiki and Kaka'ako can be redesigned incrementally to adapt to that level of sea level rise.
And if you can talk us through what some of those adoptions would look like in this process of making these adjustments as it moves along, as developers that continue to develop the Kaka'ako area, and as you mentioned that example with the rail line, what other things, specific things, are they taking into account, as well as when talking about maybe the redevelopment of and redesigning of Ala Moana Beach Park, things like that? I mean, what are some of those factors that should be considered, knowing this information that we have now?
Well, take a look at Ala Moana Center. The ground level parking lot and the commercial area that is at the parking lot level, which is mostly under heavy shade because of the overlying parking levels, that can be flooded. And the commercial area down there at the ground level is relatively small and less developed than the primary Ala Moana Center shopping areas, which are the second and third floors. So Ala Moana Center is already actually fairly well designed for sea level rise. And several years ago, they put in at significant cost a whole new set of pumps so that when it does rain, they will pump the water back out to the ocean through their storm drain system. They have had a long history of high tide flooding. Most people are not aware of this, but they have a set of pumps that are working during the highest tides to prevent the parking area from being flooded. Ala Moana Beach can be migrated landward. There is a nice open grassy area. Yes, we have that little retaining wall, and then you have the road and place where everybody parks. But all that is easily movable, and the beach itself can be relocated in a more landward location. I don't think we're going to be needing to worry about that for the next couple of decades. Right now, that beach will narrow with erosion, and we can widen it with sand augmentation, or beach nourishment, it's called. And to mention two other important aspects of this problem of sea level rise, many people don't realize that most of the flooding comes from the water table, the groundwater table underneath our developed areas, because that sits slightly above high tide, and the water table goes up and down with the tides in the ocean. So as the ocean goes up due to sea level rise, the water table goes up with sea level rise. And so you actually get flooding under roads and under buildings, and that's what we need to adapt to. A lot of the potholes and damage to our roads comes from sapping or groundwater underneath pulling away the foundation or weakening the foundation underneath our roads. And a second aspect of sea level rise flooding is that we have our storm drain system. So when it rains, the runoff will go down, run along the gutter, then down into a culvert, and then out through a series of pipes to a nearby canal like the Alawai, or out to the ocean. Well, during high tide with sea level rise, the ocean comes up the same system and floods into our gutters and onto the road. So that's called storm drain backflow. And in Miami Beach, they've had this problem for a long time. They have put in large pumps that will take runoff or rainfall, clean it, and then pump it out through pressurized lines into Biscayne Bay. For us, that would be Alawai Canal, for instance, in Waikiki. So there are lots of engineering approaches to mitigating the flooding during the first foot or two of sea level rise.
What you're describing to me sounds like we're going to be living in Venice. Like I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around it. And while there's, an asset like Ala Moana Center, which has a lot of money and is able to put in pumps like that, I'm also thinking about all those walk-ups in a community like Waikiki, those buildings that are built in the 40s and 50s and maybe some even earlier. Do they have the capability? I mean, would you just then lose the first apartment? How would this actually work? Because you can't have sort of a hodgepodge where the road is raised, but the building is still here. How does that actually work on a cohesive community level?
Yunji, you've identified one of the biggest challenges here, which is the timing, right? We have private properties, we have resort properties, which are also private. Then you have public assets like parks and roads and buried infrastructure. Our sewage and fresh water lines are buried typically underneath the roads. What's the timing involved in adapting all of these to sea level rise in a way that they don't cause worse flooding on each other? it's achievable. It will need to be worked out. And I can tell you that the Department of Planning and Permitting with the City and County of Honolulu is extremely aware of sea level rise. They've even published 2 documents on sea level rise adaptation design from other communities around the world. They've had a series of pop-up meetings with DPP planners, putting up posters in public areas to discuss sea level rise. They've been working on this for several years. We are not yet at the sort of edge of the cliff where we need to spend the large amounts of money to bring the community into full adaptation to sea level rise, but they're very focused on this. And yes, the little 4-story walk-ups. I was just on a committee of a student in the department, the School of Architecture, where they spent 2 years imagining a set of those 4-story walk-ups adapted to 3 feet of sea level rise. And it's entirely possible. And you're right, the first floor is going to have to become some sort of public use, and at high tide, it won't be usable. But elevated walkways and an intertidal basin connected to the Alawai, where high tide comes in and out between the buildings. It's all carefully engineered and designed to mitigate the flooding. There are ways to do this, at least during this century. It does get very problematic when we start getting up to 5 or 6 feet of sea level rise, which currently, fingers crossed, is not going to happen until very late in the century or next century.
I want to bring in another question, and it's something that we actually talked about earlier. Are king tides something new? Growing up here, I never heard of the term in earlier decades, not even in the 80s. If you can explain where king tides come from and how we hear that and why we hear that maybe a little more frequently now.
So the term king tides is new to Hawaii, but it's been used in Australia for a couple of decades. It migrated into Micronesia. I first heard it in Ponape, used about 10, 15 years ago. And then this idea of high tide flooding began to get a lot of scientific attention. It started with NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Their physical oceanographers focused on extreme tide flooding along the east coast of the US. And the Sea Grant program at the universities in South Carolina and North Carolina picked up the term king tide. And that was about 2014, 2015. And with that, we started using the term around here. And now our Sea Grant program at University of Hawaii has a king tide project where they announce when these high tides are going to occur and invite citizens to go out and take photos of the flooding. And we now have a huge archive that documents when and where flooding occurs during these high tides. A king tide is also known as a lunar perigee. It's when the sun, the earth, and the moon are lined up, so the gravitational pull on our tides is greatest. It's also when earth and moon are closest together. And then you can add to it, if these occur in the summertime, which they do, then you have thermal expansion of the ocean because it's summer and it's warmer and the ocean level is a little higher because it's thermally expanded. You add all these things together and you get an extraordinarily high tide. And if there happens to be a swell event running or an onshore wind, and we had one, we had an extremely high tide December 5th and 6th, and we had a Kona low system hit Hawaii, record-setting weather event that rained extremely hard. We saw Kalakaua Avenue flooded up 2 to 3 feet deep because of all these factors combined together. So king tide is just an informal term that is now widely used to represent extreme tide flooding.
You know, you were talking about some of the longer term solutions in Waikiki, you know, removing that first floor and what have you. I want to bring in this picture. This was something that was in the paper last week. This is a homeowner on the North Shore. You can see that white home there in the middle, who's basically taken matters into his own hands and put up those black tarps to stop the ground beneath his home basically from washing away. What advice do you have? And this is unpermitted, by the way. If you missed that story, it's a very interesting one in the paper last week. But what advice do you have for homeowners in the immediate, right now, I've got a house on the beach or, an asset near the beach. What can they do, short of, selling the house?
Breaking the law. Well, if you have a beachfront home and you have not yet experienced this problem, you need to prepare for it. It's going to happen. Our beaches are all wanting to move landward, and your home is going to be standing still while that happens. Personally, selling it to someone else without them knowing what they're getting into, I don't think is the right approach. But actually, we're about to become the first state in the nation where there is a requirement to tell homeowners that are purchasing a property that falls within the 3.2 foot sea level rise exposure area. So we have a law disclosing real estate transactions to owners when they're buying in a sea level rise vulnerable area. The homeowners that are in that photo are in a world of hurt. There really is no good solution here. They need to work with state agencies and county agencies, because you've got both levels of government involved here, and working collaboratively to figure out an exit strategy. Is there land that can be traded? Is there state land someplace else or county land someplace else that can be traded? Is there an interim mortgage assistance program that could be created for homeowners that are not in that photo, but perhaps up on the North Shore, that are illegally renting their homes to tourists? Could there be a forgiveness program where there is financing provided and they accrue some assets then that they would give their property over to the state or the county? I think that every particular home and family has an economic solution, and we need to create an economic toolbox which is appropriate for everything from some of those homes or buildings are corporate owned, and others have been in families passed down through generations, and you have everything in between. It will take quite a bit of analysis and study, but it certainly can be done. It can be done by a local consulting firm. It could be done by UHERO, University of Hawaii Economic Research Organization. It's possible to find solutions to this. We just haven't really invested in the studies that are needed.
As we wind up our conversation this morning, I want to give you an opportunity for a final thought and final message to our viewers out there. I think there are a lot of people who are obviously concerned of what's happening and the inevitability of what is going to happen down the line with many of these homes, as we've been talking about. But what would your final message be to those watching out there who maybe want to help or get involved in somewhere? What little things can everyday people do in this issue and topic moving forward?
Well, this chronic coastal erosion problem is related to sea level rise, and sea level rise is related to climate change. This is a pivotal decade. This decade of the 2020s are when we need to stop investing in fossil fuels. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. We need to do this for the safety of our children. But there are other global crises as well. We are deforesting huge parts of the planet. This is releasing diseases, and that's leading to an era of pandemics. And there are many communities around the world that are not treated equitably compared to those of us in the Western North America, European, and similarly well-developed nations. Humanity is at a pivot point right now. These pictures on the North Shore are examples, but there are other examples of displaced families around the world. We really need to transition to a type of socio-economy that values other people equitably, that gets away from dirty air pollution as a source of energy, and that migrates away from heavy, intense consumption, especially from tropical biodiverse countries that are located largely in the southern hemisphere or in the tropics. Eat a more plant-based diet. Vote your conscience when it comes to planet Earth. Don't be a heavy consumer. Buy things and hang on to them and recycle them. And we need to get away from this type of society that uses up the planet and instead works with the planet at rates that the planet can operate at, can recycle.
Such an important message. Thank you so much, Dr. Fletcher, for sharing all of your wisdom with us this morning. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you for bringing attention to the problem.
Thank you. Aloha.
Aloha. Wow, Ryan, really interesting to hear his predictions for Waikiki and beyond. Just that idea that the rail route has already raised a certain number of feet to make that adaptation. Should we actually need to raise the road? The idea that the Department of Planning and Permitting is already taking this into account, and that there could be an era where the first floor of all those walk-ups and really basically that whole part of Waikiki is then raised that much higher, and we sort of give that back, if you will, that the beach is brought more inland, whether we like it or not. You know, Dr. Fletcher laid out that this is something that is going to be with us for years to come. And he talked about just how important this next decade is to reducing our consumption. But just really interesting to hear his thoughts on all levels of this issue.
Yeah, and as we see some of the things that are happening on the North Shore with those homes and those communities, you heard his warning that this is something that will be a problem for those homeowners. This is not something that will just kind of go away over time. And these homeowners who live on the water have to begin thinking about what the next steps would be, whether it be something that will be in their lifetime or maybe passed on to their children to have to deal with. But this is something that no doubt will continue to be an issue that we will see come up as maybe many homeowners fight to try to find a way to protect their homes for not necessarily the inevitability of what's going to happen, but just for the time being. And interesting just to hear his thoughts about how moving forward, the city and state need to begin thinking about how to plan and prepare for a much different landscape of what things could look like in those communities closest to the ocean.
Yeah, he's obviously an expert in the field. We so appreciate his time this morning. It's really interesting to hear his thoughts. When you saw that home collapse into the ocean recently, it seems sort of like an isolated, oh, poor them. But what he's saying is basically, if you've got beachfront property, whether you like it or not, that could be coming your way. Very interesting to hear from him. And on Wednesday, Ryan, we're going to be talking to a different guest, focusing with Alaska Airlines and also Kanu Hawaii.
That's why we're going to be talking to Alaska about just their efforts in Hawaii, what they're seeing in trends as the summer season kicks up with the travel industry, and their partnership with Kanu Hawaii in Volunteer Week and things that are being done on a local level as this talk of sustainable tourism continues to move forward, how companies like Alaska Airlines are partnering with some of the local agencies to give back and find ways to support the community. It's become an important partnership and conversation that many in the tourist industry are now having with some of these nonprofit organizations, and we look to highlight some of the efforts that are being had there. And we'll finish the week spending time speaking and catching up with Senator Brian Schott. So a lot to look forward to in the week ahead. We hope you'll join us right back here on Wednesday. Until then, take care and aloha.
Aloha.
This episode of Spotlight Hawaii is brought to you by Longstrugs.